Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll have a new music video from Alyssa Corinne. But first, our guest is Steve Martins, Associate Professor of Architecture at North Dakota State University and co-author of what you're here to talk about today, a book entitled Buildings of North Dakota. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad for the opportunity. Thank you.
As we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're originally from.
Well, I came to North Dakota as a junior in high school. My parents had an opportunity to teach on the Fort Berthold Reservation, and so I went my last 2 years of school out in western North Dakota and graduated, and so I arrived in North Dakota in about 1967 and have felt like a North Dakotan ever since.
Yeah, well, sure. Now, again, you're here to talk today about a book that I believe you co-authored. But let's talk about the book a little bit, and when will it be released, and so when can the public get a hold of it?
Sure. It's currently being offered for pre-sale through Amazon and Barnes & Noble and the University of Virginia Press. University of Virginia Press is the publisher of the book, and they promised us that it will be out in print by middle of April. So that's a little bit later than it was originally promised to us, but we think they're good for their commitment to have it in hand right after first of the year.
Yeah, now, before we came on the air here, of course, we talked a little bit. How did you get involved? When did you get involved? And just sort of the ideas of the book?
Well, it was just one of those happy strokes of good fortune, I guess, in my experience. My co-author and colleague Ron Ramsey came to North Dakota at about the same time I did, and he started at NDSU as an architecture history professor. And I was a student in architecture at the time, and after I graduated, I spent several years in architectural practice. Because of Ron's reputation and many connections nationally, when the Society of Architectural Historians decided to do a series of books about the buildings of the various states, they approached Ron about doing a Buildings of North Dakota volume, and this would be in about 2002. Seems like a long time ago now, but they asked Ron to put together a plan for gathering images and telling the stories of the history of North Dakota's buildings, and Ron was gracious enough to invite me to assist him. He and I sort of come at architecture and architectural history from slightly different directions. He's very much interested in high-style architecture and the work of famous, well-known architects, and my interests probably go a bit more to the vernacular, the commonplace buildings out in the rural landscape and so forth. So we felt that we could sort of cover the field by our various specialized interests in this. And so in 2002 we started the process in earnest, although I suppose if I thought back earlier than that, because we've each been here for about 50 years now, we've been watching the landscapes and the buildings of North Dakota for a good many years before that. So.
Yeah, well, sure. Well, now I understand there are some wonderful photos that will be included in the book, and we're going to be showing some of those to our folks while we're talking. But where did you go in the state to find all these buildings?
Well, I had the great pleasure of probably visiting every community in the state of North Dakota. Ron and I set as one of our goals in the very beginning that we didn't want it to just be a book about the major cities or the larger architectural edifices, but we set as our objective to find at least 2 or 3 buildings in every county of the state that would reflect on something that was unique and special about our state and about that particular place. And I'm glad to say that we managed to find some great illustrative material from every part of the state, every corner of the state, and it's I mentioned what a privilege it is to have the luxury of being able to spend the time. It's nice to take about 3 nice fall days when the sunlight is long and go out and get some photographs that really show these buildings to their best advantage. So.
Well, with that said, do you think people realize the architecture that they may drive by every day, or or do they just not pay attention? What do you think?
Well, I've been kind of surprised. We've had a lot of opportunities to talk with people in different parts of the state about our project and about why we're interested in old buildings and so forth. And I suppose I started by assuming that that topic might be of interest to an architect or somebody that is in that line of work. But what I've been surprised to discover is that people in other parts of the state really do pay attention to their local surroundings. And so while you or I might go by something at 75 miles an hour on the interstate and not notice it, people that are around this heritage day in and day out have even maybe more than appreciation, I would say a passion for things that they consider part of their birthright.
Interesting there. What about people from other parts of the country? One of the things I think I was told was they can't believe the skies that we have, probably with the setting behind the buildings, and they think you photoshopped that in.
It's really been, the feedback has been kind of remarkable. Ron and I have presented the images at a couple of national conferences. The book project was actually originally envisioned by the Society of Architectural Historians, an academic organization that's all university professors and people who teach and do research into the history of architecture. And they envision this, I think, as something that would be a guidebook and would provide background to help people from outside North Dakota understand the state. So I think their original vision was that it ought to be written to an academic audience, or toward people who have maybe a scholarly perspective on architecture. And perhaps it's not letting a secret out of the bag to confess that Ron and I, we saw it in a very much different. We feel that we've maintained a high standard as far as the factual content and sort of describing things in terms that would be familiar to academics. But we really wanted to write the story of North Dakota's buildings and landscapes from the perspective that would make sense to not only the current generation of North Dakotans, but maybe to future North Dakotans as well. So it's we've tried to make it very accessible to a popular audience.
Okay, well that's neat, because obviously two different perspectives maybe, and were you able to really intertwine it so that it worked? I mean, obviously you're going to say that, but well, that had to be challenging in some ways too.
Yeah, again, for the whole time that Ron and I have been working as teaching faculty, we get a lot of opportunities to go out to communities and talk with local people about why architecture should matter to them, and how it's, we sort of use this jargon and say that architecture is an aspect of cultural heritage, or it's a humanities thing, and people, I like the fact that people will often hold your feet to the fire and say, well, what exactly does that mean? And you get to asking questions, you realize that the buildings tell stories about their ethnic ancestry. It tells story about the priorities of their communities, about the time at which the communities were established, or when change happened, and so forth. So I think the buildings really embody a lot of local history that local people can relate to, maybe in a more legitimate way even than people with a prurient curiosity from outside the area who come in and want to just sort of see these remarkable buildings. But I like your reference to the story about the photoshopped images. One in particular that I remember cropped up, it was of a Ukrainian Orthodox church in Wilton, North Dakota, that's just absolutely photogenic. And we happened to be there on a day like we get so many days of in the fall and summer, and the skies were just brilliant blue with puffy clouds, and the people who have seen the images are complimentary. They say, "Gee, it's a wonderful building. It looks beautiful in light, but why did you have to tweak the sky?" And so it's a reminder that oftentimes we don't stop to think about or appreciate how wonderful these landscapes really are, how much they add to the quality of life, and how much they're really a part of why we live in North Dakota, why we like to be here.
Good, nice story. What are some of your favorite buildings that are in the book?
I'm really fascinated by the earliest buildings that were built by immigrant populations, who really brought with them a kind of background knowledge of the way of building churches or homes or connective house barns and so forth, and then how they translated and applied that to an unfamiliar setting in North Dakota. The other main, I guess, type of buildings that I have probably an unhealthy, excessive interest in is all the work of the Great Depression. The State Historical Society, about halfway through this Buildings of North Dakota project, gave me an opportunity to do a statewide study of Depression-era architecture in the state. And it was completely apart from the book project, but it just fed all kinds of images and content in. So I'm really amazed and impressed and fascinated by the legacy of buildings that were built during a really unbelievably difficult economic time, a time of environmental disaster where our landscapes were just needed rehabilitation, and to see how much we've continued to utilize that infrastructure, the wisdom of that investment, I'm fascinated by that architecture.
Well, you already mentioned one church, but can you talk about some of the churches in the region and what all you saw there? And
Well, it kind of goes to your first observations too about how projects like this that acknowledge local people's heritage, it really inspires engagement. I know a number of publications, gallery exhibits, program that was recorded for Prairie Public about the Prairie churches of North Dakota. That was a long-standing project, and in a way it acknowledges or affirms or validates that there's something important in each of these communities. And so just a few weeks ago, I guess the 2nd of August, I had a chance to be up in Mountain, North Dakota for their August the Deuce celebration, and to attend a church service at Viker Lutheran, the Icelandic Lutheran Church in Mountain, and to see that maybe in comparison or relationship to the amazing Germans from Russia, German-Hungarian church in Leffer, North Dakota. In each part of the state, you can definitely see the hand and you can see what was different in terms of importance and priority. What were the cultural values of the people that built those places?
Mm-hmm. Now, are churches going to be the oldest buildings that you featured, or are there others?
Probably they won't be the oldest. There are some very early churches that are represented, but I think of churches as being established sort of from the time of the first Dakota boom, when the land was being taken up for farming and so forth. We do have some very early churches, an interesting set of fieldstone churches in the eastern part of the state. Castleton has a wonderful one in Buffalo, and Lakota has one, and so those feature prominently because they were the work of some of North Dakota's earliest architects, the Hancock brothers, and so they figure rather prominently. But I suspect the earliest buildings in the state may have been simple homes, simple houses, and we've also tried to give a little bit of emphasis to the Native American traditions for occupancy of this landscape. I think there were some very sophisticated building traditions from the Hidatsa and Mandan, and we both see evidence of that on the landscape today, and I think there's been a reawakening of appreciation for what that says about how people understood their relationship to the Missouri River Valley, for example.
Okay. Well, we find very good architecture on college campuses also. What about some of that?
Yeah, because I'm around that architecture every day. Actually, my office is in downtown Fargo on the campus downtown, but I think all of the state institution campuses are rather interesting. You tend to find maybe some patterns or some commonalities. UND, for example, there's a great consistency in all the architectural style there because they wanted to emulate the collegiate Gothic style of the Ivy League schools and so forth. So you find from buildings of all ages and generations at UND a very a consistent similarity. At NDSU, by comparison, it seems like about every 10 years when it came time to build a new building, they would go in a distinctly different direction, and so there's much more variety. I think something else that people may not be very mindful of on the campuses of the state institutions, if you think about the State Mental Hospital in Jamestown, the State Industrial School at Mandan, many of these campuses actually were planned according to high-style landscape architecture tradition by the firm of Morrill and Nichols, a Twin Cities landscape architecture firm that planned the direction and basically established the design patterns for many of the campuses.
Okay. Well, now, I understand that you write that there was nothing good built in the 1950s and 60s. Why do you say that?
I may have said that sometime. My students oftentimes corner me and say, do you remember that time you said? And I think, gee, that doesn't really sound like something I ought to have said. I do have maybe a skeptical perspective on much of what was done in the 1950s. But the bottom line is, yes, there was some really remarkable, well-done architecture from the 1940s and 50s. I think if you think in terms of architecture being influenced by national events, that post-war period was a period of great pragmatism, and people were not very much infatuated by beauty and by sort of refinement of the designs. But for example, we're about to lose the original Fargo City Hall done by the internationally famous architect Ralph Rapson. And I think that building is of really premier importance nationally. So we're glad to have had the opportunity to record some of those buildings that are either endangered or have been lost. There's some remarkable architecture from the 50s at the Assumption Abbey Complex, University of Mary Complex, and so there are little bits and pieces in various parts of the state. But if someone was to hold me down to that claim that maybe there's not as much good architecture that we look to from the 50s, it may come from the fact that it's sort of hard to get close to that kind of architecture. People have had traditionally a difficulty making an emotional tie with it, or feeling that it really embodies the uniqueness of their place. It's kind of an architecture of everywhere. It's the same architecture that you find in so many other places. And so I think we're just now beginning to sort of come to terms with the better instances or examples of architecture from that period.
What about some of the old depots? What did you find there?
It's a pretty rich palette when you think about all the impact that the railroads had on establishment of North Dakota, just even the pattern of cities and so forth. But from the Wimbledon Depot, where Peggy Lee sort of got her early experiences, to a wonderful little depot down in Venturia, the larger cities that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, that places like Rugby and Fargo and Minot and Bismarck have really not only remarkably well-designed and well-planned depots, but buildings that have stood the test of time, that still really hold their place as an arrival place within the community. And related to all that railroad infrastructure, we might also just stop and think a little bit about some of the other unusual features of the landscape. Devil's Lake has the amazing Great Northern Hotel that was adaptively used as a senior housing complex, one of the first real successful renovation projects in the state. And that was the gateway, the arrival point for people coming into the community of Devil's Lake. In other parts of the state, it just amazes me to see the photograph of the lift bridge and tunnel at Cartwright, the Fairview Cartwright Bridge in far western North Dakota, that essentially it was a lift span so that they could still take barges up the little Yellowstone River, and it entered into a tunnel that ascended the grade going out toward Killdeer. And then once it got out of that Yellowstone Valley, they had a section referred to as the $1 Million Fill, where by cutting and filling by hand, people using mules and flatbed wagons and so forth, they leveled the grade and gradient. So a lot of that infrastructure we think of as engineering infrastructure, but that's part of the architectural heritage of North Dakota too.
Well, I understand you recently presented at the North Dakota Governor's History Conference in Bismarck. How was your reception there?
We've gotten so many wonderful receptions and had so many opportunities to share this book. It's surprised me how much engagement there is, that the public really is eager and hungry for this information. The Governor's History Conference was planned around the idea of using historic themes to teach elementary school students, or K-12 students more broadly. And the State Historical Society has done a unit of study that encourages people to use local history as a topic to engage young people in their communities. And so we'd like to think that maybe sharing their architectural heritage, getting young people excited about local buildings that perhaps they overlook or have taken for granted, that in every part of the state there are really wonderful and important examples of well-planned, beautiful, and thoroughly functional architecture. And that should be a kind of a model for, I think, anyone perhaps considering a career as an emerging architect.
We're running out of time, and I wish I could ask all these questions, but what did you include buildings that are falling into ruin from the old days?
The book series requires that the buildings have to still be standing structure. Okay. And so as much as we really wanted to reflect on buildings that are no longer there, we maintained our focus. We wrote descriptions and included images only of standing structures.
Mm-hmm. So what about modern architecture? What are your thoughts on this?
I guess, how does that saying go, that all music was new once, I think, is you hear the phrase oftentimes. I think it's sometimes hard to appreciate where we are in terms of the modern era or whatever. I think, my observation as it relates to North Dakota architecture is that beginning in the 1960s, there were a couple of generations of new North Dakota architects that really saw as part of their responsibility and duty to make a gift of architecture to design buildings as well as they possibly could.
What's the job opportunities for those, architecture grads?
6 or 8 years ago, things were kind of tough in all professions in the country, but we have our architecture students from NDSU seem to always be in demand everywhere around the country, and so we have a steady crop of new students that come to NDSU wanting to learn architecture. They all have different visions about where they want to go with their life, but I'm really glad that some of them have chosen to stay in North Dakota and make their careers doing important public buildings here.
Well, with that said, if people want more information or to get your book, where can they go? Who can they contact?
It's currently offered for pre-sale from Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and the University of Virginia Press, and they each have it pretty well described there. I might also just mention in that regard that there's going to be a little bit of a teaser. There's a digital online version of the book as well, published under the title Archipedia, and it's published by the Society of Architectural Historians to give people an idea of what the content will be.
All right. Steve, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you.
Appreciate the conversation.
All right. Stay tuned for more. Susan Brown was a mixed-blood Dakota Indian, and although she was surrounded by influential people who had an impact on politics in the mid and late 1800s, her own identity and story has been somewhat lost to history. Enjoy Alisa Corinne's musical adaptation of Brown's life in the song, Who Was I?
Father was French Canadian and Dakota Yanktonay. My mother's grandfather was the great Chief Red Wing. My husband was one of the men who built Minnesota, and my son was a hero in the Sioux Uprising. Joe met me when he was married to wife number 2. He nursed me back to health when I got shot. He moved in with me and had 7 children. It took him 15 years to tie the knot. They wrote about my husband, my father, my son, but then they were done. So who was I? Who was I? Who was I? Oh, tell me something about my life. Oh, tell me something mattered in my life. Lived in a world where there was Indian and white. Do you know if I was both or neither? Lived in a world where families were mixed, where marriages sealed business interests. I lived in a time of confusion when 2 cultures fought for a hold. As white pioneers built new lives, and the Indians tried to save their own. They wrote about the wars, the treaties and guns, but then they were done. So who was I? Who was I? Who was I? Tell me something about my life. Oh, tell me something mattered in my life. What was it like for me? Oh, I can't tell you. I'm long gone. You can learn that in the uprising of 1862, I saved myself by claiming Indian blood. You can learn my husband bought me a piano from New York. He had no chance to hear me play before he died. You can learn I was a woman of note years ago, and that I lived till I was 85. They wrote about my husband, my father, my son, but then they were done. me something mattered in my life. Tell me something mattered in my life. Oh, tell me something mattered in my life. Tell me something mattered in my life.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.